French President Emmanuel Macron is visiting 4 African nations, hoping to reset relations. But he faces competition for influence from others, including China, Russia and Turkey. So what kind of welcome will he get? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. French President Emmanuel Macron is visiting 4 nations in Central Africa. He's hoping to regain influence in a continent where the former colonial power now faces competition from other nations, notably China and Russia. Macron says he wants to reset ties, promising a new partnership of equals. He's visiting countries he has not been to before: Gabon, Angola, Republic of Congo and Democratic Republic of Congo. France has announced it's scaling back its military presence on the continent, pulling out of Mali, Central African Republic and Burkina Faso, where the government ordered them out. We'll have a lot to discuss with our guests, but first, this report from Paul Brennan.
After decades of colonialism and neo-colonialism, it was France's withdrawal from Mali last year and Burkina Faso this year which emphatically confirmed the shifting geopolitics in Central Africa. French troops were forced to leave when the military junta in each of those countries opted for a new alliance with Russia in the form of the mercenary Wagner Group. President Macron openly admits that mistakes were made in Mali, and his 4-nation tour of Central Africa will sell a more cooperative vision with host nations. Cultural, scientific and educational partnerships, and military bases where the French troops operate as partners rather than commanders.
The reorganization is not meant to be a retreat or a disengagement. It will materialize through an Africanization or mutual operation of these big bases.
General Dominique Trinquant is the former head of the French military mission at the United Nations. He agrees the importance of France staying militarily engaged in the region.
We have to have small teams, air power, for example, to help this African country. This is exactly the case in Niger, for example, where the parliament asks the French forces to stay and to fight in support of the Nigerian forces. That's probably the case also in Chad, where we've got a big air base.
In Central Africa itself, some see the rejection of French influence as understandable, but nonetheless alarming and irrational. Yes, there is anger about European neo-colonialism. However, the alliances being offered by China and Russia bring their own issues.
The Western world has abused its position of domination. It's a very difficult period in our history because when people are not rational anymore, like now, they just have one goal. We want to get rid of France. We want to get rid of the old system, actually, and not realizing that what is ahead is not probably better than what they are running away from.
President Macron embarks on this tour, admitting that for too long France has regarded Africa with what he described as the logic of rent. His new vision is to offer a more mutually beneficial partnership. But he faces an uphill task to turn around that wave of anti-French sentiment. Paul Brennan, Al Jazeera, Paris.
OK, let's bring in our guests. In Paris, Lara Marlowe, author and journalist based in France, covering events there, and a foreign correspondent for many, many years. In Yaoundé, Marie Roger-Beloa, president of Africa International Media Group and an Africa Affairs analyst. And in Johannesburg, Marissa Lorenzo, a political risk analyst specialising in Southern Africa. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for being on Inside Story today. Lara, Macron called this the start of a new balanced relationship. What is he ultimately trying to achieve with this tour?
I think he wants to reverse the trend, which is France being thrown out of Mali, being thrown out of Ouagadougou, out of Burkina Faso, and the French being disliked, distrusted by popular opinion throughout, especially in West Africa, where they've been making and breaking regimes since the Second World War or since independence. And the old policy, which started under General de Gaulle after the war, was called France-Afrique, La France-Afrique, which was made one word of the names France and Africa. And when you look at the heads of state who Macron will be seeing in Gabon, Ali Bongo, his father was president before him. The Bongo family has been running Gabon for 56 years. In Angola, the same party has been in power since 1975, since independence. In the Republic of Congo, Denis Sassou Nguesso has been in power for 43 years. The Democratic Republic of Congo, his last day, Felix Tshisekedi will try to use Macron's visit, I think, for his own political strength. And so Macron, on the one hand, he wants democracy. He talks a lot about the youth of the country. He gave a very important speech in Ouagadougou 5 years ago to young people. And at the same time, he's perceived to be an ally of these old undemocratic regimes. So that's a difficult thing for him. But he really wants to change the relationship. He says he's going to reduce the number of French soldiers in Africa, especially in French-speaking West Africa. He will not touch the numbers in Djibouti because that's a very strategic place for obvious reasons. But he's going to reduce the number of French soldiers. And he says by the end of this year, there will be no French bases per se in Africa. They're either going to turn them into military academies where they will educate African soldiers, or they will co-manage them with the governments of the host countries. So he's trying to get a lower profile. He also wants to sell weapons probably to Africa, but he'll have a hard time there because the Russian and Chinese and Turkish weapons are much cheaper than the French weapons. He may offer help, military help, for example, intelligence, satellite images, and fire support to these African regimes. But he just basically, this is a goodwill mission. It's his 18th trip to Africa, it should be noted. He realizes how important Africa is to the future of Europe. And he also believes very strongly that if you don't solve the problems of Africa in Africa, you will have to deal with the migrants coming across the Mediterranean.
Marie, what sort of reception is Macron likely to get when he visits Africa?
Well, I would say it would be probably like the announcement of his visit. You know, prior to that, he had a very much announced and anticipated speech, which were supposed to tell us about the new thinking, the new policy, his new African policy. I must say I'm here in Yaoundé and I see that was no news. Nobody really was interested in listening, and that was a very big contrast between the way people were not interested here and the way a lot of hype, which was in Paris prior to this speech.
Did that come as a surprise to you that there was no hype around his visit?
Well, you know, when a French president comes to an African country, well, it's always something special. But I don't think people are expecting much from it. So, you know, the official topic is environment. It is about protecting the forests and so on. But to most observers, to most Africans who follow this, they see that Macron is going to Central Africa, where the franc CFA is still strong and alive, where there's little protest, well, against France, even though the French, the anti-French sentiment still is there. So it's like they're coming to oil-rich countries and trying to rescue the influence of France in an area where you don't have a very strong conflict about that, except, of course, Central African Republic, where the paramilitary group Wagner is well installed now.
Marissa, we also heard Lara talk there a little bit about Macron needing to change the thread. What do you think he needs to do to make this a successful trip?
So I don't think that this trip is going to be as difficult as what Macron has faced in other West African countries where France has effectively been kicked out. France has a relatively good relationship with Gabon. He's going to the environmental summit there. It's not a very politically charged event. When he comes down to Angola, I also think that this will be a lot easier for him. And then when it comes to the two Congos, I also don't think that he's going to run into too much trouble there. But I think that we need to look at what is his political aim here. And the first very obvious one is, like Lara mentioned, to reverse this trend of this backlash against France. But I think, that is one very important political aim. But I think the other one is that, France needs to keep a kind of base of support in Africa. And what he's realized is that Gabon is the one country in West Africa that is not pushed back against France. He realizes that the DRC is also very important to the West's future because of all the minerals that it holds. And then he needs Angola because Angolan President João Lourenço is actually a very important mediator between the DRC and Rwandan conflict. So there's actually quite a lot on his plate. And of course, yes, the focus is to reverse this trend. It is to stop this backlash against France. But there's a lot of political agendas going on at the same time.
Lara, you touched on this a little bit before. There's obviously a large African population within France. What's the perception there about this trip? And do they think that, that is something that he actually needs to do at this point in time? Or does he need to deal with some of the issues back home?
Macron has actually cited the large African population in France as an advantage that he has in improving relations with African countries. He says he wants to use them, exploit them in a positive way. He said, we must recognize the African part of France. Now, that's going to upset people on the far right, for example. But I think that to young Africans in France, that's probably music to their ears. He also wants to encourage entrepreneurship and loans for investment in Africa and this sort of thing. So I think that dynamic young Africans in France will see this as an opportunity. He also, it should be said, wants to Europeanize this relationship because, for one thing, if he does so, it will ease that anti-French tension because it becomes somehow diffuse within, if it's Europe that is engaging with Africa rather than the old colonial power of France. And it also gives a sort of critical mass for big investment, structural infrastructure projects and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Marissa, I just want to talk a little bit about the military influence that France has got and the scaling back of troops and the 6 military bases that will stay open but are going to be transformed into training academies. What does France lose by scaling back in that way, and why do you think they're doing it now?
So I think what France loses is, of course, some of the power and the influence that it does exert over certain African countries. But of course, France doesn't have a choice at the moment because it's seen with what's happened in Mali and with what's happened in Burkina Faso that it really has to take charge and it has to do something, else it might face further backlash. The other thing is that Macron is not going to apologize for colonialism. He's not going to start to issue reparations. If we look at how he's responded to Algeria's call over the years for an apology, we've always seen that Macron and even other French presidents have always fallen just short of that. They've experienced shame. They've expressed shame. They've said it was a brutal period, in the history, but they've never really gone out and made a full-on apology. And I think that in itself could also be a dangerous thing to do because France's presence across colonial Africa was so massive. And of course, once you start apologizing, then you need to start thinking about reparations. And European countries are only going to give reparations to their former colonies if then they can ensure that that money is used in some way that will benefit them. For example, when Germany gave Namibia reparations for the 1904 Herero genocide, that money is actually going to be directed to infrastructure that Germany will eventually benefit from. So France has quite a big issue with that. And I think scaling back military bases is kind of the best solution that he could come to out of what is quite a difficult situation.
Yeah, we spoke a little bit about it before, the growing Russian, Chinese and Turkey influence in Africa. Lara, you know, we've seen the foreign minister from Russia, Sergei Lavrov, you know, go on a charm offensive on his own tour of Africa just last month. That's obviously a huge concern to the French. Can you explain the scale of the Russian influence in Africa now and how concerning that is to Macron and the rest of Europe?
It's enormous. I mean, the Wagner group, the Prigozhin's militiamen or mercenaries, are very deeply implanted in Sudan and in Mali. In fact, it's probably thanks to Wagner that the French were expelled from Mali. And they're also very engaged in propaganda against the French. I mean, really mendacious propaganda against the French. I think that the war in Ukraine has diminished that a bit because, as you know, Wagner is very deeply involved in the Donbass and in the whole war in Ukraine, and where they're responsible for some horrendous war crimes, as they have been in Africa. The line that one gets from the Élysée is that the inhabitants of Africa will learn very quickly at their cost that they're much better off with the French than they are with the Russians, with Wagner. I wondered if I could, I'd like to come back to something Clarissa said about Macron is not going to apologize. In Algeria, he actually said France committed crimes against humanity in Algeria. And there was a huge uproar in France. This went down very, very badly, especially on the right. I think he'll be very careful what he says, in particular, just to avoid an outcry like that. But he has made some serious gestures. He gave back works of art to Benin, and he's also opened up the archives concerning Rwanda, where the French were accused of complicity in the genocide against the Hutus. Against the Tutsis, not the Hutus. So he will make, I mean, I don't know if he will on this specific trip, but he has and will continue to make important gestures.
OK, well, we'll see what comes out of that. Marie-Roger, can you just tell us about the Russian disinformation campaigns that they have been unleashing through Africa and just how effective they have been?
Okay, you know, the thing is that France wants to focus everything on Russia and the propaganda of Russia. But what I want to say that, and I will just repeat it, is that Russia and the presence or the increasing presence of Russia is due to grievances and dissatisfaction with France, and not the contrary. Russia has been a long-standing partner in Africa. You know, many countries have had relationship with Russia since before independence, and during the where Russia, the Soviet Union, used to help independence movement or freedom fighters. So, and then they faded away during the Cold War. In a way, they were supporting part of the countries, okay, the Cold War. But now, for a long time, many other countries, European countries, Germany, Russia, and others, did not dare to come to African countries, to former Francophone countries. They were like, if they want to start some important operations, even business, and so they want to make sure France is not against that. So it was really, the king is France, and we have to make a low profile and make sure we don't disturb or bother France too much, because they also have other relationship with France, Russia, France, or Germany with France.
What are the concerns, though, going forward about Russia's growing influence?
Okay, what went forward, the first big example in sub-Saharan Africa is the Central African Republic. You know, the new regime came after election with Faustin Touadéra, and the country was under embargo, weapon embargo, because they had so many conflicts. So the UN, the United Nations decided no weapons going there. But what happens was that the rebels were getting weapons on illegal ways. And the official government wanted this embargo to be lifted. And they asked French to help them lift that embargo. And France was not really interested. And they said, well, they said, why don't you ask Russia? They can give you some little arms and that's what they did. I'm making a long story short. So that's why they turned to Russia. Russia were sort of, they didn't really believe. France told you to come to us, yes. And that's the way they came into.
I just want to bring in...
now...
I just want to bring in Marissa here, if I may, just on this point. I mean, what are the risks for some of these African countries in siding with Russia? You know, we know all about the Wagner Group and what they're capable of. What risks are there here for some of these countries and these governments that I guess, get into bed with Russia?
So I think the first important thing to note is that we have to be very careful of blaming Russia as being the destabilizing force in Africa. What Russia has done and what the Wagner Group is still doing is that they are taking advantage of failed states. So essentially there has been a power vacuum. And I mean, we could look at why this has been. Colonialism left these states in complete disarray. It made it very, very easy for new governments to come in and be corrupt. There was not political will to actually govern properly. Then, especially in West Africa, we've had the rise of extremist groups for over a decade now. We first saw Al-Qaeda, we've got ISIS, sometimes in countries you've got both of them. And what Russia's come in and done, or the Wagner Group has done, and obviously these are two separate things, even though sometimes they can overlap, is that they've come in and they've taken advantage of that. But they've only been able to take advantage of that because there is essentially state failure. You can't come and take control of a strong state. The other thing that I want to point out that I think we have to add to this debate so that we don't become too one-sided is that African countries have also changed the way they approach their relationship with foreign powers. It's not the Cold War anymore where you have to side with the US or you have to side with the Soviet Union. You don't have to be loyal to a former colonial power because that's the only way you're going to get trade and arms. You can actually pick and choose. Now, yes, we've got some countries like Burkina Faso and Mali that will be very outright in their support of Russia. But you have other countries that are saying, let's just hear what Russia has to say. We don't necessarily have to accept them wholeheartedly, but we can hear what they have to say, because we can also hear what France has to say. And I think what we're seeing is, yes, it's going to be very difficult for African countries going forward, but I don't think we should be saying things like, if they thought things were bad under France, wait till it's under Russia. The point is that African governments, whether they're making a mistake or not, you know, I don't think that's necessarily our place to say. But I think what we have to say is that we're dictating our future in a very, very different way.
Yeah.
And that essentially France is not going to be a dominant player. It's going to be one of many players going forward.
And just on one of those other players that's also heavily involved in Africa, Lara, can you just tell us a little bit about China's influence on the continent?
It's mainly economic. I mean, for example, China is now a bigger trading partner with Algeria than France is, which is quite mind-boggling when you think that Algeria was an integral part of France until independence in 1962. China is, in exchange for the natural resources of the mineral resources, in particular of these African countries, is building factories, industry, sending large numbers of Chinese immigrants, you know, to run them. So whereas the Russian influence is mainly military, the Chinese influence is economic, industrial, financial.
Yeah. Marissa, just before we finish, I want to get an idea of what you think a successful trip will look like for Macron.
I think if France can keep in place, for example, some of the trade agreements that it has with the DRC, that would be very good for it. France is also a very old trading partner with Angola. I think that relationship is relatively secure. It's important that he keeps it that way because of the amount of French oil and gas majors that operate in the country. So I think if there's cordial trips, if he keeps those trade agreements intact, if maybe he commits money towards Gabon's carbon credit program, I think small gestures like that would be a sign of success. I don't think we're going to see anything major coming out of these. He has kind of chosen what you could call, I suppose, quiet, reasonable governments to engage with compared to what France has faced in West Africa. And I think this trip is just to entrench those relations, get some small agreements out, and I think he would be happy with that.
Marie-Roger, if you could just outline how you think this trip will be seen as a success from within Africa.
I don't think it would change anything. The countries which are visited, the head of state of that will have some of diplomatic success that we had. The French president here, Gabon is having an election this year, and the opposition was afraid that this visit might look as an endorsement of the outgoing president. So he will be happy about that. But the main issue about the anti-French sentiment, how can France can enhance its position in Africa, I don't think it would change very much in the areas anyway where France is being rejected. There are the areas like DRC where the sentiment is not the same. It's not a former colonial master. Maybe they are not very happy because France is not criticizing and condemning outright the invasion of the eastern part of Congo by the M23, the Rwanda-backed 23 rebels. And so if they stay in that position that they don't want to be unpleasant to Rwanda, and nobody will be really satisfied, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We will have to leave it there, unfortunately, but it'll be fascinating to see how his tour plays out. Thanks to all of our guests, Lara Marlowe, Marie-Roger Beloa and Marissa Lorenzo. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Tom McRae, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.